Added disclaimer: I am not a doctor. Do not take my video as a formal medical or psychological diagnosis. Thank you. I made a very similar video to this a while ago, about 2 years ago. Sadly, it somehow got deleted at some point and I never thought to remake it. But after a live stream where Irate Alex actually talked about this subject and actually mentioned the video that I no longer had, and after some research that proved that the information that I used in that video is now outdated, I decided to remake it. So, here it is once again, an inside look at ADHD version 2, Electric Boogaloo apparently. If you've ever been a part of the public school system, medical field, or just haven't been living under a rock for the past 25-30 years, you've probably heard of a term called ADHD. But what do these letters actually mean? Well, ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder. So what is it? Well, it's two things. One, it's a learning disorder, which is pretty self-explanatory. It is also a neurological disorder, contrary to popular belief, which most people think that ADHD is psychological or psychiatric. That is incorrect. It being a neurological disorder pretty much just means that this can be formally diagnosed by a medical professional such as a neurologist, and it is actually recommended that you do get tested by a neurologist. So what are the symptoms? Well, for ADHD, there is aggression, though this is more common in males than in females, excitability, fidgeting, though not always a symptom, hyperactivity. This refers to both the stereotype of the ADHD kid pinging off the walls like a Super Bowl on crack, and also to having hyperactive brainwaves and hyperactive thought patterns. Impulsivity, irritability, lack of restraint, persistent repetition of words or actions are also common. Cognitive symptoms are absent-mindedness, difficulty focusing, forgetfulness. This is for short-term memory actually, not long-term, as the average person without ADHD can usually remember around 7-ish things in their short-term memory, where someone with ADHD can more or less only remember maybe 4. They have problems paying attention and or short attention span. Their moods, anger, anxiety, boredom, excitement, and other such similar mood swings. It's also common for them to suffer from depression, other learning disabilities, and frequent anxiety. Now, this was actually formerly 2 different disorders, which was ADHD and ADD, or Attention Deficit Disorder, which the symptoms were actually quite similar, but not exact. Those symptoms were problems focusing, impulsive behavior, disorganization, difficulty with multitasking, problems prioritizing things, difficulty with time management, problems focusing on a task, excessive activity or restlessness, problems with planning ahead, being easily frustrated, frequent mood swings, problems completing tasks and following through with things, being short-tempered, easily stressed, and frequent anxiety. Now, the two have been more or less conflated into the same diagnosis, as it was found that the symptoms more or less enmeshed quite often. So who does this disorder affect? Well, literally anyone can have it. In fact, 6.4 million Americans alone have it, and about 1.5 million adults in the UK have the condition. This includes kids, teens, and yes, adults as well, as all can have ADHD. So what causes it? Well, ADHD has genetic and environmental factors, and as such, there's no one singular cause for it. However, it is known to affect certain parts of the brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, which functions as an intersection for attention, behavior, and emotional responses. For people with ADHD, attention is switched very easily. The basal ganglia, which is the neural circuit system that regulates communication within the brain. In people with ADHD, there is a short circuit that can cause inattention and or impulsivity. The limbic system, which regulates emotions, Deficiency of dopamine in the ADHD limbic system may result in restlessness, inattention, and emotional validity. And also the reticular activating system is also affected. Now, the major relay system between the brain's pathways is where this is, and a dopamine deficiency may cause the impulsivity and hyperactivity because of it. So when are people diagnosed normally? Well, that's a bit of a toss-up. Some people get diagnosed very early, and that is ideal, as you can get diagnosed as young as 4 to 7 years old. Others, however, don't get diagnosed until their mid to late teens, and most unfortunately, there are individuals who don't get diagnosed until they're well into their adult. Unfortunately, even in the modern day and age, there are still a lot of myths, misconceptions, and stigma against such neurological and neurobehavioral disorders such as ADHD. Now, unfortunately, there were so many of them, I could not fit them all into one video, so I'm just going to go over a few. ADHD is caused by bad parenting. Actually, most cases of ADHD are due to the accumulation and interaction of many genetic and environmental effects that change the brain in a manner that leads to the symptoms of ADHD. As a matter of fact, 12 areas of the human genome harbor risk genes for ADHD. Now, while each individual gene by itself only has a very small impact on the risk of ADHD, you get enough of them together and, well, you get ADHD basically. Scientists have also discovered that many environmental risk factors for ADHD occur very early on in the development of the brain. In short, there is literally no evidence that poor parenting leads to the inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity that define ADHD. ADHD isn't real. Well, good luck arguing with the over 100,000 articles in scientific journals on the topic of ADHD and its precursor labels, the accounts going back all the way to 1775, and the neuroimaging research that has shown evidence that ADHD is associated with impaired functioning of the prefrontal cortex. Well, everyone has a little ADHD. No, they don't. The structure, volume, chemical activity, and communication in pathways in the brain of people with ADHD are very different than those without it. Well, ADHD is just an excuse for laziness. ADHD symptoms are the result of a neural message in their brains not being effectively transmitted. You see, when a task interests someone with ADHD, neural messages tend to be very strong, which intensifies motivation. This is also where the hyperfocus symptom comes in. However, when the tasks are not perceived as interesting, the neural messages tend to be much weaker and insufficient to activate the needed actions. For 80 to 90% of those with ADHD, medication can significantly improve such problems. Well, ADHD is only diagnosed in the United States. No. ADHD occurs worldwide, with a prevalence recently estimated at only about 7%. Cultural norms and access to healthcare has greatly impacted the level of diagnosis as well. Ergo, if you don't have access to medical care, then odds are you're not gonna get diagnosed with anything, let alone ADHD. Well, ADHD can be cured with a diet. No. ADHD cannot be cured, period, let alone cured with a diet. Experts have actually recommended treatment with medicine, i.e. chewable tablets, liquid form, patches, pills, etc., as a part of a total treatment plan, not the only treatment, but one small part, which may also include therapy, counseling, and behavioral interventions. Well, you can overcome ADHD with willpower. No, you can't. Kind of like you can't overcome autism with sheer willpower. ADHD is one of the most common childhood disorders and can continue throughout adolescence and adulthood. And in fact, a lot of the time it does. Now, available treatments focus on reducing the symptoms of ADHD and improving the functionality of the brain. Well, my preschooler of this and this age is too young to have ADHD. While yes, many parents do believe that ADHD is a problem for school-age children, it is in fact the symptoms of ADHD and the diagnosis of the condition that can occur as early as the preschool years, like I said, 4 to 7 years old. And at times, even doctors have a difficulty differentiating normal behavior from those struggling with ADHD. Although a child may normally have characteristics like being impulsive or being hyper, these can also be symptoms of ADHD. And a pediatrician will evaluate the intensity of these behaviors in a preschooler to help them make a diagnosis. ADHD is diagnosed when these problems get to the point where they are significantly and consistently interfering with the preschooler's life, development, self-esteem, and general level of functioning. Oh, they're just a handful or a daydreamer, but that's just normal. They just don't let kids be kids these days. While it's true that most, if not all, children are impulsive, active, and inattentive at times, sometimes to an extreme, a child with ADHD is more than just a handful or a daydreamer. His or her hyperactivity or inattentiveness constitutes a real day-to-day functional disability. That is, it seriously and consistently impedes their ability to succeed in school, fit into family routines, follow household rules, maintain friendships, interact positively with family members, avoid injury, or otherwise manage in his or her own environment. This clear functional disability is what pediatricians and other doctors look for when diagnosing ADHD and recommending treatment. Well, the treatment for ADHD will cure it, and the goal is to get off the medication as soon as possible. No, ADHD is a chronic condition that often does not entirely go away. Instead, it just changes over time. Many older adolescents and adults are able to organize their life and use techniques that allow them to forego medical treatment, although a significant number of them do continue to use various forms of treatment and use support throughout their lifetimes. Now, depending on the circumstances and demands as a person matures, this may or may not include continuing with medication or other treatments for ADHD at different times of their life. The true goal is to function well at each stage of childhood, adolescence, and as an adult, rather than to just stop any and all treatment as soon as possible. Well, they focus on insert task here, so they can't have ADHD. For the most part, ADHD poses a problem with tasks that require focused attention over long periods of time, not so much for activities that are highly engaging or stimulating. School can be especially challenging for a person with ADHD because the typical classroom lecture, compared to that of, let's say, a video game or something, can be relatively unstimulating in terms of visual, sound, and physical activity. Assignments can require long and sustained organized thought and effort, and the daily routine can be less structured and predictable than a child with ADHD might require. Most children with ADHD are diagnosed during their school years precisely because of the academic, social, and behavioral demands during these years that are so difficult for them. The difficulties that such children experience may make it seem that the school could be the problem, and while it is certainly a possibility and should be considered, it is more likely to be the result of the child's struggle to manage their environment. If after a careful evaluation a child doesn't receive the ADHD diagnosis, then they don't need help. ADHD is diagnosed on a continuum, which means that a child can exhibit a number of ADHD-type behaviors and yet not to the extent that he or she is diagnosed with ADHD. This doesn't mean that they don't need help with coping with the problem that they are having. Well, children with ADHD just outgrow their condition. While many parents and many doctors once believed that as children with ADHD to enter adolescence and then move on to adulthood, that their ADHD would no longer be an issue. But recent studies have shown that some aspects of ADHD can persist well into the adult life for as many as 85% of these children. Some adults can still benefit from the use of ADHD medication and will do so for the rest of their lives. Well, ADHD is more for boys. Girls really don't have ADHD, or it's less severe than it is with boys. ADHD in girls and women has been recognized only in the past few decades, and more research studies are reporting on the substantial impairments they experience, often to the same extent as boys. They are at risk for many of the same coexisting conditions and impairment as males: oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, academic and social impairments, driving problems, substance abuse, and risky sexual behavior. Adolescent girls with ADHD may be more prone than boys to eating disorders, but by young adulthood, this difference is reduced. The truth is that girls just tend to be diagnosed later in life than boys, as they tend to show different symptoms. Kind of like in the same way that a woman will have different heart attack symptoms than a man.